How do you get people who obviously disagree with you to listen to you when you're making your arguments? This has got to be one of the hardest things to do. There's a lot of times you have to have difficult conversations with people who clearly don't see things the way you do. It could be a personal matter in your personal life. It could be a business presentation. It could be a direction you want to take your team in where people completely disagree with you. It could even be about politics. There's a lot of situations in life where you must have difficult conversations and have them effectively. Otherwise, you're not going to be where you want to be, and your team is not going to be where you want to be. Now, today, we'll focus on how to do that, and we'll unveil a very simple behavior, a very simple action that you can take in order to massively increase the chances that people who disagree with you would actually listen to your argument. As usual, we'll back it up with research. So if you want to have better conversations, especially difficult ones, stick around. So the first step is you want to understand what your goal is, okay? Oftentimes, people think that when they talk to people they disagree with, the goal is to get them to agree with you. That's not how things work. If you've ever tried to convince somebody of something they really disagree with, you quickly realize that's a very, very difficult thing to do, even impossible. In fact, the only way to convince somebody of something they initially disagree with is to get them to convince themselves. You don't get to decide what other people's opinions would be. So your goal is not to convince. Rather, your goal is to get them to listen to you, to open up and hear your thoughts so they can chew on those thoughts, so they can marinate on those thoughts, so they can think about what you have to say and incorporate that in their minds in what they're already thinking about. Okay? The second thing you want to understand is there's no magic bullet, okay? There are more effective ways and less effective ways to articulate your arguments. And the difference between the more effective and the less effective ways is vast. So today we'll focus on a much more effective way to articulate your arguments to people you disagree with. So you really have two options when you present your argument to people. The first option is you provide hard data, hard facts. And people think that's a strong option because if I can provide data for what I'm thinking about, if I can talk about the facts, surely that's objective. Surely that's something people cannot disagree with, they cannot dispute. So if I'm having a personal disagreement about very simple matters like who cleans the house, who washes the dishes, I can record who did what for the past week, and I can come to my spouse or come to my roommate and say,
hey, last week I did the dishes 6 times, you did it only once.
And that's data, right? If I'm talking about something more weighty, like a policy issue, like let's say gun control, okay, should we let people have guns or should we not let people have guns? I can provide data. I can provide studies that show that either guns reduce crime and make people safer or guns increase crime and make people not safe. Well, that option actually does not work. Yes, you do need to talk about data and facts, but people are only going to be convinced by those, even if they're stellar, even if they're solid, people are only going to be convinced by those if they're already open to hearing your argument. So instead, here's another option. The second option that you can utilize is a personal story. Okay, so you can talk about an issue by relaying it in a personal story that you have had, a personal experience. So let's take our example with washing dishes in a rooming or a co-living situation. You can talk about, for example, about how you were late to a very important job interview because the house was a mess. Or you had a very important client meeting or a very important friend coming in and it took you forever to clean up the house and that was very stressful for you. If we're talking about gun control, you can talk about a friend or a personal situation that happened to you where you felt safe, you were able to protect yourself because you had a firearm or this friend had a firearm. Or vice versa, if you're pro-gun control, you can talk about a situation where somebody else had a gun and they made you feel unsafe. That's a different way to start discussing an issue where somebody disagrees with you. So we have two options. We have talking about data and talking about personal stories. Now, if you look at research, research first measured what people think is more effective, okay? So in a particular study that I'm talking about,
and links are in the description,
participants freely responded to a question about what they thought would increase respect for their opinions. And this research was done in a political domain, because we want to look at the hardest topic that we have to talk about, which probably is going to be politics this day and age. And most participants believe that starting with facts and statistics would be more helpful, would make people respect them more, while only a minority thought that talking about their personal experiences would be helpful. Now, that's their intuition, but the intuition is not always right. Yes, there's obvious reasons why data is, or are, because data is plural,
if you're a nerd,
why data is better than personal stories. A personal story is not representative by definition. A personal story can be overly emotional and it can be perceived as emotionally manipulative, okay? So eventually, if you're talking to smart people and sophisticated people, you want to get to representative data and facts. But as I said, you want to get there when people are already open to hearing your argument. And so what I want to argue to you today, based on the research, is that a personal story actually works better in getting people to respect you and open up and listen to your arguments. That works a lot better than presenting data. So let's go into the studies that are most relevant in the research paper I'm describing today. So the first study actually looked at comments to YouTube videos, and these were YouTube videos about different issues related to politics.
So stuff that's easy to talk about, right? Like abortion or gun control, very easy stuff, right?
And what the researchers did was they analyzed the comments for each of these videos. There were hundreds of videos in the sample. And they measured the extent to which the comments were focused on personal stories and the personal experiences of the person making the comment, or about facts and data. So they had that on one side, and on the other side, they put the text through an automated analysis to measure the sentiment. Is the comment positive or negative? What they found was that the comments that are about personal experiences were associated with more positive emotions and positive tone and affiliative language, that is, language that is meant to connect, compared to comments that were focused on data and statistics. In other words, there was greater engagement when comments were focused on personal stories rather than data about these issues that are related to politics. In another study, they had people have real face-to-face conversation with another person about gun policy. That is, should you allow people to carry guns versus not? So what they did was they recruited a research assistant to talk to participants. Now, the participants did not know this was a research assistant. They thought this was a regular person talking to them. And so they asked the research assistant to either talk about a personal experience related to having a gun or not having a gun, or they asked the research assistant to talk about statistics, so crime statistics or statistics related to whether we should carry guns or not. Now, the research assistant was trained to always go against the opinion of the participant. The participant either was pro-gun control, was against gun control, and the research assistant was always either sharing a personal story or sharing data that went against what the participant was thinking. But what they found was that participants who were exposed to another person, the research assistant, who was talking to them using personal experiences and personal stories, rated that person as more rational, they respected that person more, and they were more willing to interact with that person than when the research assistant was using facts to make their case. So in the last study I want to talk about today, the researchers look at archives of interviews on news networks. So they used Fox News for the right-wing bias and then CNN for the left-wing bias. And they used transcripts of interviews on divisive issues. And so what they found was when the guests, the people who were being interviewed, shared more personal experiences than fact, they were treated with more respect by the hosts. The way the researchers measured that is they asked research assistants to rate how much respect they thought the hosts, the people who ran the shows, gave to their guests, the people they were interviewing. So you'd have a liberal host and a conservative guest, and you'd find that the liberal host would give greater respect to the conservative guest when that guest focused on personal experiences as opposed to facts and data. As I said, the interesting part is that people believe that their opponents, the people they disagree with, are actually more rational when they used personal stories as opposed to data, even though making judgments based on data seems more rational.
It's like, listen, I completely disagree with you. I can't imagine how anyone would reach that conclusion that you did. But if that thing that you told me about were to happen to me, I can see how I might be led to think that way.
So it's very, very interesting that personal stories are more effective in getting people to open up and at least listen to you than using data. So let's illustrate what this means in this video, okay? So imagine that my argument is that using personal stories leads to better reception than using data, at least initially. So let's say I have two ways of making this argument to you, and you judge which one is more effective. So I might start by saying, listen, studies show that in pitches to venture capital investors, 62% of pitches that start with a personal story by the founder were eventually invested in, whereas only 45% of the pitches that started with data about the market and the product they were in were actually invested in. So that's one way I can go. Another way I can go is, hey, I'm an investor. Let me tell you about the very first company I decided to invest in. The founder gave me the following pitch. He said he lived in a small town in North Carolina his whole life. It was a town where factories used to keep everybody going, but over the years, he watched those plants close one by one, moving overseas. His friends, these are guys he grew up with, went to church with, sent his kids to school with. They lost their jobs over time. So good people suddenly were struggling. And it broke his heart, and that's why he invented his product, which was an adjustable rack for pickup trucks. And that helped workers load up things that they need for their daily jobs. And the key was he was going to make his product in his hometown so that he could give jobs to his friends, to the people he grew up with. And that was the reason, the big reason why he started his company, to help them out. So he wouldn't budge on that even when people pushed him, when I pushed him as an investor to make the product outside of the United States because it's cheaper. So for him, it was about giving back to the people from his hometown. Okay, so we have these two ways. On one hand, I told you that in general, on average, it's better to use a personal story to pitch your investment to a venture capitalist. That is representative data, that is a statistic, that seems more credible than the personal story of that one investor who talked to me about being in North Carolina and trying to help his hometown. However, you want to ask yourself, which one of these is more effective for you? Now, for most people, the contrast is pretty clear. The story is more effective, even though the data is more definitive from an actually rational perspective. So when you present, when you talk to somebody, when you start, especially to people who either don't share your point of view or don't really care to engage with you, starting with a personal story to illustrate your point is better. Eventually, you'll have to get to the data if you really want to convince them, but to open them up, to get their ears to prick up, start with a personal story. That is usually better. So what makes for a good story? Do you have to be a great storyteller like Tom Clancy to be able to get people engaged in stories? The reality is not so much. There are only a few things you have to think about when you tell your story. The first one is it should be relevant to the point you eventually are trying to make. Okay, so if you're pitching a product, tell a story about that product. Don't tell a story about something else. If you're talking about public policy, tell a story related to public policy, and so on and so forth. So relevance is number one. Second, the best stories are also personal. Something that happened to you is better than something that happened to somebody else. And if you have to go with something that happened to somebody else, it should be somebody close to you as opposed to somebody you barely know. So more personal, better. Also, the best stories should explain some pain point, should be about some harm or difficulty that you've had, some problem you had to overcome. People really relate to overcoming a problem, to overcoming an obstacle, okay? There's various ways of sharing a personal experience, and framing it as a problem you had to overcome is usually very good in getting people to engage in you. So here's an example. I might say, a couple of years ago, I hit rock bottom. The pandemic cost me my job, and suddenly I was stuck at home. My bills were piling up, and I was feeling completely isolated. And that's when I discovered YouTube, and I discovered that there are creators who are sharing their stories, and that gave me hope and a spark, and I decided to start my own channel because of that. So that is a story where I talk about a problem, the pandemic, I lost my job, and so on. And then I'm saying, well, I decided to start my YouTube channel as a way to overcome it. Now, there's other ways to tell a personal story. For example, I can say, I've always loved to share tips and stories with friends, and one day I stumbled across some cool YouTube channel while browsing online. I thought, hey, this looks fun and I can really do that. I can really help a lot of people. So I grabbed my phone and I started filming simple videos about my hobbies. And I just kept going because I enjoyed the creative process and a lot of people liked it. So that is a very positive story about why I started a YouTube channel. But I would suggest to you that it's less effective than the story that talked about a problem or an obstacle, because people relate to not so much the obstacle, not so much the problem, but the ability to overcome it. They really like, quote unquote, redemption stories, stories where a person has a problem and perseveres through it and succeeds. Okay, so what are some caveats to this idea of using personal stories? Okay, so personal stories are a great starting point. They're a great starting point for an argument, but eventually data and actually logical arguments are necessary. What you want is to start the appetite for people to listen to you, to open up your audience to your arguments and data that are coming later. You don't want to waste your best data on people who are not really listening to you. And a personal story is a way to get them to listen to you. It's not replacing the data, it's starting with, and then the data comes later. Another caveat is you want to make sure you don't go on too long with your stories. You don't go on and on and on so the person thinks that you're wasting their time. You have to make sure that you are communicating, that you value the time of the person listening to you, because you already know that they don't agree with you. And so you don't want to appear like now you're taking up their time with something that they're not sure what you're talking about. So when you tell your story, don't go on too long, get to the point. Another caveat is that you want to connect clearly the story to the point of your presentation. You want to explain exactly why you're telling the story and how it supports your argument. You want to draw a clear connection. It might be clear in your mind why that story led to your position right now, but it's not clear in the other person's mind, and anyway, they disagree with you. Anyway, they don't think like you do. So you want to draw it out very, very clearly at the end of your personal story or experience that you're sharing. Finally, when you tell your story, you don't want to lean too heavily on the emotional side. You can risk overdoing it and appearing like you're trying to emotionally manipulate your audience. That's not great. You have to remember, most people don't start with a story. Most people think that if they have data, they just go with the data. Most people also don't have the conversation to begin with, or they act angry or passive aggressive or numerous other non-constructive behaviors. So just the fact that you're sharing a personal story with somebody you disagree with somebody that you wouldn't necessarily want to have a conversation with, just the fact that you're engaging with that person in that way is already unique. And it's much more engaging than the vast majority of conversations that people have. So there's no need for you to pile on by adding additional emotion to your story. Just tell the story. If there's emotion in it, add it, but you don't want to really pile it on because that could be overdoing it. Okay, so now you have it. A way to have a difficult conversation. There are many reasons why conversations can be difficult, but one of them is people just disagree with you. So here's an easy way to start the conversation in a way that opens people up to listen to you even though they disagree with you. Share a personal story of why you came to believe in what you believe, of why you came to the opinion that you have, and the other person will be much more open to have a discussion with you. I hope this was helpful. If you like this, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you later for more videos with psychological insights about real life. Thanks so much.